I read John 20 for years before I saw what was there. But when I saw it, it changed the whole resurrection for me. There is a detail that ordinary reading never registers: the linen cloths lying on the stone floor, the folded napkin set apart in a place of its own, two angels seated, one at the head, the other at the feet, exactly where the body had lain. Stop, read it again. That arrangement is not decorative, it is deliberate. And when you open Leviticus 16 alongside John 20, what looked like a scene of discovery turns out to be something else entirely. That tomb is not a tomb, it is the Holy of Holies, and this is the detail that changes the whole resurrection. A note before we continue. This channel is entering a new chapter. From today onward, the format you will see is different, more layered, more transparent, with my own hand visible in the work. I will appear in some moments. The desk where I read and study the Bible will appear. The process behind these investigations will no longer be hidden. The earlier videos of this channel will be made available on Patreon in the coming weeks, for those who want to keep them within reach. Nothing of the substance changes. The text, the discipline, the reading, these remain. What changes is the visibility of the hand behind the voice. Now, back to John 20. Notice the order in which John records the facts. In verse 1 of chapter 20, the evangelist writes, "The first day of the week cometh Mary Magdalene early, when it was yet dark, unto the sepulchre." The first day of the week, early in the morning, while it was yet dark. The temporal marker is not casual. In Greek, the phrase is skotias eti ouses, while it was still darkness. And this is the same word that opens the Gospel. In verse 5 of chapter 1, when the evangelist declares that the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. It is the same atmosphere that surrounds Judas in verse 30 of chapter 13, when the text records plainly, "And it was night." Mary Magdalene is walking literally in the dark, but the evangelist wants you to see something more. She is also walking in the darkness of one who does not yet know what the dawn will bring. Geography matters. John had already planted in verse 41 of chapter 19 a piece of information that none of the other three Gospels preserves. Now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new sepulchre. A garden, a new sepulchre. The other evangelists speak only of the tomb. Only John names the garden. The detail is not decorative, it is deliberate, and it will matter again. Mary arrives, she looks, and she sees what she was not expecting. The stone is gone. In Greek, the participle is ermenon, perfect passive of the verb airo, not a simple past, a perfect, completed action with permanent effects. The stone has been taken away, and it will remain taken away. Mary's reaction is purely earthly. In verse 2, she runs to Peter and the beloved disciple and says, "They have taken away the Lord out of the sepulchre, and we know not where they have laid him." They have taken him. We do not know. The first hypothesis that occurs to her is the most human one possible. Someone has stolen the body. And here the evangelist begins to draw in silence his theological diagram. Because the stone, notice, was not removed in order to let Jesus out. Anyone who reads the chapter to the end will see, in verse 19, that the risen Christ appears to the disciples with the doors shut, when the doors were shut. A glorified body does not need stones moved aside. The stone was removed to let the witnesses in, and what those witnesses are about to find inside looks like nothing they have ever seen before. Peter and the beloved disciple hear Mary's words, and they run. In verse 3, the evangelist writes, "Peter therefore went forth, and that other disciple, and came to the sepulchre." In verse 4, he adds a detail only an eyewitness would record. "So they ran both together, and the other disciple did outrun Peter, and came first to the sepulchre." The two went out together, the two ran together, but the beloved disciple, the one tradition identifies as John himself, arrived first. This is not narrative vanity, It is testimony. John writes in verse 24 of chapter 21, "This is the disciple which testifieth of these things, and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true." The evangelist marks his own presence as evidence, and here Greek opens a window that the English translation closes. In 3 consecutive verses, John uses 3 different verbs to describe the act of seeing. There is a parallel that translation flattens. In verse 5, when the beloved disciple stoops at the entrance of the tomb, the verb is blepe, immediate sight, the glance of someone who looks and registers. He sees the cloths. He does not enter. In verse 6, when Peter arrives, breathless, and goes in without hesitation, the verb changes. It is theorē, attentive, prolonged observation. It is the verb from which the words theatre and theory derive. Peter does not glance, he studies. He examines every detail, every fold, every position. And in verse 8, when the beloved disciple finally enters the tomb himself, the verb shifts a 3rd time. It is eidon, perception that comprehends, seeing that is understanding. Then went in also that other disciple, which came first to the sepulchre, and he saw and believed. He saw and he believed. 3 verbs, 3 steps. Blepe, theorē, eidon. The glance, the study, the understanding. In Greek, the word is different at each moment. But the most disturbing detail of this scene is not what the 2 disciples saw. It is what the text chooses not to say about one of them. Verse 8 is specific. It says the other disciple saw and believed. It says nothing of Peter. Peter went in first. Peter studied the cloths with the verb of attentive contemplation. And the evangelist, who had recorded the race with such care, omits, deliberately, any mention of Peter's faith in that instant. The Gospel of Luke, in verse 12 of chapter 24, completes the Johannine silence. Then arose Peter, and ran unto the sepulchre, and stooping down, he beheld the linen clothes laid by themselves, and departed, wondering in himself at that which was come to pass. Wondering. In Greek, thaumazon, participle of the verb thaumazo, cognitive stupor, astonishment without understanding. It is not faith. Peter sees the cloths. Peter sees the evidence. Peter sees the same thing John sees, and Peter walks away without believing. The clue, the reason one sees and the other does not, is in the cloths. And to read it, you must open a book neither of them was carrying that morning, but which both of them knew by heart. The book of Leviticus. Verse 10 is brief, almost administrative. Then the disciples went away again unto their own home. The disciples went away. They went home. But verse 11 opens with a Greek word that holds up the entire next scene, haisteke, pluperfect of the verb histemi. It does not just say she was standing, it says she stood firm, planted in place, a posture that persisted while the others left. But Mary stood without at the sepulchre weeping. Peter left, John left, Mary stayed. Mary bends down. The verb is parekipsin, exactly the same one John had used of himself in verse 5. Mary does what the beloved disciple had done. She stoops, she looks inside. But what Mary sees is different. John saw cloths, Mary sees angels. In verse 12 the evangelist writes, "And seeth 2 angels in white sitting, the one at the head and the other at the feet, where the body of Jesus had lain." Notice the geometric precision of the detail. 2 angels, dressed in white, seated, one at the head, the other at the feet, in the place where the body of Jesus had lain. Stop. This is the first time in the entire Gospel of John that angels appear. In 20 chapters, from the prologue through Cana, the Samaritan woman, the raising of Lazarus, the Last Supper, the Passion, John had never shown an angel. And now, at the moment of resurrection, 2 appear, in a very specific arrangement. The detail is not decorative, it is deliberate, and it will matter again. The angels speak, and their first word is a question. Woman, why weepest thou? Woman, why are you weeping? The question has a strangeness that escapes a quick reading. These are angels. They come from heaven. They come from the place where the Lamb has just been glorified. And the first thing they say to Mary is a question whose answer is, from the heavenly point of view, obvious. Mary answers with the same sentence as in verse 2, now worn thin by grief. Because they have taken away my Lord, and I know not where they have laid him. And it is at this moment, as she finishes the sentence, still bent over the tomb, that the evangelist records in verse 14 one of the most subtle details in the fourth gospel. And when she had thus said, she turned herself back and saw Jesus standing. She turns, without anyone touching her, without anyone calling her. Mary, mid-sentence, turns, as if the presence behind her was strong enough to make her wheel around. Christ is there, but she does not recognize him. And the same question repeats, but with a difference that is the key to the recognition. Verse 15 opens with one of the most delicate sentences in the Gospel. Jesus saith unto her, Woman, why weepest thou? Whom seekest thou? Woman, why weepest thou? Whom seekest thou? Notice the order in which the evangelist records the facts. The first question is the same one the angels had asked just 2 verses before. But Christ adds a second. Whom seekest thou? The repetition is not redundancy, it is diagnosis. In Greek, Christ's question is tina zetes, not ti, but tina. Not what do you seek, but whom do you seek? Mary thinks she is searching for a corpse, a thing, a body to be moved. Christ, by changing a single letter, lifts her to another level. You are not seeking a what, you are seeking a whom. And there is an echo here that translation erases. The first question Christ asks in the Gospel of John appears in verse 38 of chapter 1. When the first disciples begin to follow him, he turns and asks, What seek ye? What do you seek? The last question Christ asks, before revealing himself as the risen one, is the same, but lifted from thing to person. Mary, still blinded by grief, answers like someone who thinks she is talking to a workman. Sir, if thou have borne him hence, tell me where thou hast laid him, and I will take him away. But the most important detail in this verse is in what Mary thinks she is looking at. The evangelist writes, she, supposing him to be the gardener. She, supposing him to be the gardener. In Greek, the word is kēpourós, and here there is a lexical choice that deserves the reader's attention. Kēpourós appears only once in the entire New Testament. In the whole New Testament canon, this term is never used again. John chose it for this moment, only for this moment. There is a parallel that translation erases. Remember verse 41 of chapter 19, a garden, a new sepulchre. And only John, of the 4 evangelists, records this information. Not Mark, not Matthew, not Luke, only John. And now, in verse 15 of chapter 20, comes the only occurrence of kēpourós in the New Testament. The evangelist is drawing a figure. He is placing deliberately 2 elements in the same scene, a garden and a man whom Mary thinks is the gardener. Anyone who has read the Bible from the beginning knows where they have already seen this scene. In the 2nd chapter of the book of Genesis, in verse 8, it is written, And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden. A garden, planted by God. And in verse 15 of the same chapter, And the Lord God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to dress it and to keep it. The first Adam was, literally, a gardener, and it was in that garden, in chapter 3 of Genesis, that a woman was deceived by the deceiver, and death entered the world. Move the typology forward. In a garden, there now stands another woman, and she is speaking to a man whom she thinks is the gardener. But this man is not the gardener of the old Eden. This man is the second Adam, the man of the new garden. Mary's confusion is closer to the truth than she realizes. Christ is, in fact, the gardener of the new Eden. What seemed a mistake was prophecy. And it is at that moment, after this long typological setup, that the recognition happens. Christ does not argue, he does not prove, he does not show the wounds, he says only one word. Jesus saith unto her, Mary, Mary. And the evangelist, with the precision of the eyewitness, records the name in the exact form Christ pronounced it. Not Maria, the Hellenized form John had used in the previous verses, but Mariam, the Hebrew form, the Aramaic, the form she had heard 1,000 times from his lips. Mary had seen the cloths, she did not recognize him. She had seen the angels, she did not recognize him. She had seen him standing, she did not recognize him. She had heard his voice asking her 2 questions. She did not recognize him, and one word was enough. Her name, spoken in that voice. Christ had already stated it in parable, in verse 3 of chapter 10. The shepherd calleth his own sheep by name. The shepherd calls his sheep by name. The theology Christ had taught 10 chapters earlier is now fulfilled in act. Mary turns, and her answer comes back in a single word, also recorded in the original Aramaic. Rabboni, my master. The intensified, possessive, intimate form. And Christ entrusts her with a mission. Go to my brethren. Go to my brothers. This is the first time in the entire 4th Gospel that Christ calls the disciples brethren. Not servants, not friends, not disciples. Brothers. The relationship has just been raised to a level that did not exist before the cross. Mary receives the mission. She goes. She announces. The woman who stayed, the woman who did not leave, the woman who wept beside the tomb while the apostles went home, she was the first witness of the risen Christ. But the true key to this chapter, the key that turns the garden into a sanctuary and the sepulchre into a temple, has not yet been turned. 1,500 years before that morning, at Sinai, in the tent of the congregation, on the only day of the year when one man entered one place. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. In chapter 16 of the book of Leviticus, God gives Moses precise instructions for the most sacred ritual in the Hebrew calendar. Once a year, on the 10th day of the 7th month, the high priest, and only the high priest, entered the Holy of Holies, the place where the Ark of the Covenant rested, the place where the glory of God hovered over the mercy seat, the place where no other person in Israel could set foot on pain of death. And what the high priest wore that day matters decisively. In verse 4 of chapter 16 of Leviticus, it is written, He shall put on the holy linen coat, and he shall have the linen breeches upon his flesh, and shall be girded with a linen girdle, and with the linen mitre shall he be attired. These are holy garments. Linen, 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 linen. 4 times the word is repeated. 4 garments, all of the same material. Linen coat, linen breeches, linen girdle, linen mitre. Notice, on the great day of atonement, the high priest does not wear the golden vestments that Exodus 28 describes in such detail. The ephod with its precious stones, the breastplate with the 12 gems of the tribes. All of that is left outside. To enter the Holy of Holies, the high priest strips off all ornamental glory and clothes himself in plain white linen alone. The high priest, dressed entirely in linen, would enter the Holy of Holies with the blood of the sacrifice. He would sprinkle the mercy seat. He would make atonement for his own sins, for the sins of his house, for the sins of all the people. And when the work was done, when the atonement was complete, there came a part of the ritual that few know. In verse 23 of the same chapter, And Aaron shall come into the tabernacle of the congregation, and shall put off the linen garments, which he put on when he went into the holy place, and shall leave them there. He shall put off the linen garments. and he shall leave them there. Stop. Read it again. Once the atonement was finished, the high priest left the linen garments in the holy place. He did not take them with him. He did not keep them at home. He left them there, in the place where he had completed the work of atonement. They were the visible mark that the ritual had been finished. The linen garments left behind were the silent signature of a finished work. Now move forward 1500 years. Return to the garden of Joseph of Arimathea, on the morning of the first day of the week. What does John record in verse 6 of chapter 20? Then cometh Simon Peter following him, and went into the sepulchre, and seeth the linen clothes lie. The linen cloths lying there. And in verse 7, and the napkin that was about his head, not lying with the linen clothes, but wrapped together in a place by itself. The napkin, which had been over his head, set apart in a place of its own. Remember what Christ, 3 days earlier, had said from the cross in verse 30 of chapter 19 of John. It is finished. In Greek, tetelestai. It is consummated. And now, in the tomb, on the stone floor, the priestly evidence of that consummation is lying in plain sight for anyone who knows how to read. The linen cloths left behind, as Aaron left them in the sanctuary. The Epistle to the Hebrews, in verse 11 of chapter 9, declares it without circumlocution. But Christ, being come an high priest of good things to come, by a greater and more perfect tabernacle. And in verse 12, neither by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood, he entered in once into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption for us. By his own blood, once for all, into the Holy of Holies. Christ is the high priest. Christ is the victim. Christ is the one who enters the Holy of Holies. Christ is the one who sprinkles the mercy seat with his own blood. And at the end, when the work is finished, Christ leaves on the floor of the tomb the linen cloths. This is why John sees and believes, and it is why Peter sees and is bewildered. John reads a temple scene, Peter reads a crime scene. Both look at the same cloths, but what each of them sees depends on what each of them carries in his heart. Remember who Peter is that morning. 5 days earlier, in the courtyard of the high priest, Peter had denied 3 times that he knew Christ. I am not. Peter's words in Greek are exactly the opposite of Christ's words before the same tribunal. Eg me imi, I am. Christ affirms the identity that takes him to the cross. Peter denies the identity that would bind him to Christ. Peter enters the tomb under the weight of that denial. He sees the cloths, he studies the cloths. But the heart that denied 3 times still cannot make the leap from evidence to faith. Guilt closes the doors that evidence is trying to open. John, by contrast, stood at the foot of the cross. From Christ's own words, he received the care of the mother. John did not deny. And the heart that stood at the foot of the cross recognizes what the high priest left behind. Peter will only return to full faith in John 21, on the shore of the Sea of Tiberias, when Christ presses him 3 times with the question, "Lovest thou me?" A question repeated 3 times in surgical correspondence with the 3 denials. But on that morning, the shadow has not yet lifted, and Peter walks away without seeing. The linen cloths are the first part of the liturgy, but they are not the only part. Because if Christ is the high priest, and if the work is finished, then a question presses itself on us. Where on that morning is the Holy of Holies? The answer is in the 2 angels. Return to verse 12. Return with new eyes. And seeth 2 angels in white sitting, the one at the head and the other at the feet, where the body of Jesus had lain. 2 angels, dressed in white, seated, one at the head, the other at the feet. The evangelist could have written simply 2 angels in the tomb, but he chose, deliberately, to record the exact position, one at each end of the place where the body had lain, facing one another, turned toward the space between them. Anyone who knows the book of Exodus recognizes this arrangement. In chapter 25, in verse 18, God gives Moses the instructions for the construction of the Ark of the Covenant. "And thou shalt make 2 cherubims of gold, of beaten work shalt thou make them, in the 2 ends of the mercy seat. 2 cherubim, in beaten gold, at the 2 ends of the mercy seat." And verse 19, "And make 1 cherub on the one end, and the other cherub on the other end. 1 cherub at one end, the other cherub at the other end." And verse 20, "And the cherubims shall stretch forth their wings on high, covering the mercy seat with their wings, and their faces shall look one to another." Their faces turned toward one another. And verse 22, "And there I will meet with thee, and I will commune with thee from above the mercy seat, from between the 2 cherubims. From there I will speak with thee, from between the 2 cherubim." The mercy seat was the place of meeting, the place where, once a year, the high priest sprinkled the blood of atonement. And above that place hovered 2 cherubim, one at each end, facing the space between them. In Hebrew, the mercy seat is kēpourós, from the root kapar, meaning to cover, to expiate, to make propitiation. In the Greek Septuagint, it is translated hilasterion, and it is precisely this word, hilasterion, that Paul applies to Christ in verse 25 of the 3rd chapter of the letter to the Romans, "Whom God hath set forth to be a propitiation through faith in his blood." Christ is the mercy seat. Christ is the place where the blood is sprinkled. Now notice what John records, deliberately, in the geography of the tomb. 2 cherubim of gold, 2 angels dressed in white, one at each end of the mercy seat, one at each end of the slab, faces turned toward one another, positioned face to face, gazes turned toward the mercy seat, gazes turned toward the place of the body. The correspondence is symmetrical. The detail is not decorative. It is deliberate. That stone slab on the floor of the tomb is the new mercy seat. The place where the body of the Lamb had lain is now the kēpourós of the new covenant. And the evangelist, without saying so in explicit words, places 2 cherubim at the exact ends, exactly as Exodus 25 prescribes, so that the reader who knows the Old Testament may see for himself. The tomb is the Holy of Holies. Remember verse 51 of chapter 27 of Matthew, at the exact moment when Christ breathed his last on the cross. "And behold, the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom." The veil of the temple was torn in 2, from top to bottom. It was not torn by human hands, it was torn by the hand of God. And what it had separated, man from the presence of God, was no longer separated. The Holy of Holies of the temple in Jerusalem was emptied of its function in that instant. The glory no longer hovered between the golden cherubim, because the true propitiation had just taken place outside the walls, on the cross. And on the morning of the first day of the week, the new Holy of Holies reveals itself to the woman who stayed weeping in the garden. It is not a stone chamber behind a veil. It is a sepulchre carved in rock in a garden, with 2 angels where 2 cherubim had stood, and the linen cloths of the high priest left on the floor as the sign that the work is finished. Contemporary scholars, from Nicholas Lunn to Adam Kubish, have recognized this parallel with growing clarity. But the fathers of the Church, centuries before, had already intuited it. But notice, and here is the sharpest part of the parallel, the space between the 2 angels is empty. In the tabernacle of Sinai, between the 2 cherubim, rested the Ark of the Covenant, containing the tablets of the law, the manna, and the rod of Aaron. In the tomb of Jesus, between the 2 angels, nothing. Only the mark where the body had been. Why empty? Because the work is finished. Because the mercy seat of the Old Covenant contained the tablets of the law that condemned man. The mercy seat of the new covenant is empty because the law has been fulfilled in the flesh of the one who lay there, because the blood has been sprinkled, because the atonement has been made, because the Lamb is no longer between the cherubim. He has risen and is now at the right hand of the Father, as the author of Hebrews declares in verse 12 of chapter 10. But this man, after he had offered one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down on the right hand of God. The empty space between the two angels is the first thing the church saw, and the last thing she learned to read. It is finished, and he is no longer here. The clue was there, in plain sight. You only had to know where to look. And one figure was still missing. The disciple who had not been there when Christ first appeared. The one whose final confession would close the gospel like a door swinging shut. Thomas. Verse 24 introduces an absence. But Thomas, one of the 12, called Didymus, was not with them when Jesus came. Thomas, one of the 12, not with them when Jesus came. The evangelist does not explain why, he only records, and from that silence he sets the scene. The other disciples tell him what they have seen. We have seen the Lord, the same formula Mary Magdalene had used in verse 18 when she returned from the garden. It is the testimony. It is the primary apostolic formula. We have seen. And Thomas answers with one of the most famous sentences in the New Testament. Except I shall see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe. Unless I see, unless I touch, unless I thrust in my hand. In Greek, the formula is particularly forceful, ou mech pisteuso, an emphatic double negation. It is not merely, I will not believe. It is something like, by no means, under no circumstances, will I believe. Thomas slams the door shut. 8 days later, Christ appears again. Verse 26. The same closed doors, the same place, the same disciples. But this time, Thomas is there. And Christ does not rebuke him. He goes straight to him. And, in verse 27, addresses him, word for word, with the exact formula Thomas had spoken 8 days earlier in his absence. Reach hither thy finger, and behold my hands, and reach hither thy hand, and thrust it into my side. Be not faithless, but believing. Christ knew the speech behind closed doors, but the text, with remarkable delicacy, does not record that Thomas actually touched. Verse 28 leaps directly from Christ's command to Thomas's confession, as if the invitation alone had been enough. And out of his mouth comes the highest confession in all the New Testament. My Lord and my God. My Lord and my God. In Greek, ho kyrios mou, kai ho theos mou. Notice the definite article in both terms, not a Lord, a God, the Lord, the God, mine. This is the sentence that closes the Gospel of John like a door pulled shut. Remember how the Gospel began, in verse 1 of chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word was God. John opens the Gospel with the abstract theological declaration, the Word is God, and he closes it 20 chapters later on the lips of a disciple who had doubted, with the personal confession, my God. What was cosmic affirmation in the prologue becomes intimate confession in the conclusion. The circle closes. And Christ, receiving the confession, turns to the reader, and he speaks the last verse addressed to a disciple in the fourth Gospel. Jesus saith unto him, Thomas, because thou hast seen me, thou hast believed. Blessed are they that have not seen, and yet have believed. Blessed are they that have not seen, and yet have believed. Stop. This is the only beatitude in the entire Gospel of John. In 21 chapters, in all the discourses of the Good Shepherd, the true vine, the bread of life, Christ, in the fourth Gospel, had never pronounced a beatitude. There is in John no equivalent of the Sermon on the Mount. until this moment. And here, near the end of the book, in a closed room 8 days after the resurrection, Christ opens the first and only Johannine beatitude, and it is not addressed to Thomas. It is addressed to the reader. In Greek, the word is makarioi, and here there is a parallel that translation erases. There exist in the New Testament 2 Greek words translated blessed. The first is eulogetos, from you, well, and lego, to speak. It means literally, one of whom good is spoken. And it is a word that, in the entire New Testament, is applied exclusively to God. Luke uses it in verse 68 of chapter 1. Paul uses it at the opening of the letter to the Ephesians. Peter uses it at the opening of his first epistle. Eulogetos is the praise that rises to the Father. It is never used to describe a human being. The other word is makarios, and that is the word Christ chooses here. Makarios is the term of the Beatitudes of the Sermon on the Mount. It is the word that describes the human state of one who participates in the divine fullness. It is not merely emotional happiness, it is objective fullness, to flourish in the right place. And it is this word that Christ applies in this scene to the one who will not see him. Thomas had the empirical evidence. Thomas could see. Thomas could, if he wished, touch. But Christ, in pronouncing the blessing, does not bless the one who saw. He blesses the one who will not see. The verses that follow, 30 and 31, explain why. And many other signs truly did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written, that ye might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing ye might have life through his name. The beatitude and the declaration of the book's purpose are placed side by side. Christ blesses the one who believes without seeing, and the evangelist immediately records why he writes. They were written that ye might believe, without having seen. The beatitude is not a generic observation. It is a formal apostolic blessing addressed to all future generations of the Church. The reader of the 1st century, of the 4th, of the 12th, of the 18th, and the reader of today, sitting 2,000 years after that closed room. Whoever reads the Gospel and believes is not accessing a second-class faith. He is accessing the faith Christ personally blessed. The resurrection was not just a body leaving a tomb. It was the consummation of an entire liturgy that Israel had celebrated for 1,500 years. It was the eternal Yom Kippur. It was the Day of Atonement that does not need to be repeated, because it has been fulfilled once for all. And the linen cloths lying on the stone floor that morning were the silent signature of a work no priest in Jerusalem would ever have to do again. In the coming days, this channel opens a Patreon, where the deeper studies will take place, and where the earlier readings will be available in audiobook form. For those who wish to walk with this work over the long term, the place is Patreon. God bless you.